Well, hello. Hopefully everyone can see my title slide. And does that look good, Joe? Is that
Yep, you're in great shape.
all right? Thanks. Um, I'm really delighted to be presenting today at this really historic and important event. I'm a Penobscot Nation citizen and chair of Native American programs at the University of Maine, and this work, I presented pieces of this work over the last several years, but I've been trying to wrestle with and really a history, and folks like Donna Loring have actually been at the lead of this, is like really amassing the history of Maine Indian policy. So the policies put by the state to control us as Wabanaki people over the last 200 years. And this is just a little piece of that kind of work, but I wanted to emphasize sort of how sovereignty, race, and racism kind of come together in various forms of policy history. In order to teach this work, there are resources. A number of these things are covered through especially the Abbey Museum curriculum, as well as Penobscot Nation and some other pieces. But we don't have a core curriculum. Portland schools are working on something I think will really cover this quite well. So the goals for today is really thank you, Donna Loring, as well as the members of the Wabanaki Studies Commission that were appointed to implement this law, requiring the teaching of Maine Indian history and culture, and the immense amount of work, including one of my predecessors, Maureen Smith, here at the University of Maine, served as chair of the Wabanaki Studies Commission. None of this work is possible without them and so many others. And the commission itself was made up of representatives from all the tribes in Maine, as well as sort of key other educational representatives. And I urge you all to read the reports issued by the Wabanaki Studies Commission in terms of the law. I also, in terms of engaging with school age teachers, recognizing the remains of the 215 children found at the Kamloops boarding school recently. I think that experience and colonial action and their deaths at the hand of in a space where they should have been learning and not struggling to merely survive, is a really hollow reminder of what is at stake in reclaiming a more accurate history and teaching. So I want to do, for the goals of my lecture, overview some key concepts related to state of Maine Indian history and policy. Some of them might be familiar to many of you, some might not. I also want to show how issues of racial injustice have shaped the state of Maine Indian history and policy. Again, I don't think it's that surprising, but just trying to give a framework to discuss these issues is one of the key goals. And then lastly, provide a broad historical and rights context of contemporary issues related to Wabanaki tribal sovereignty. And of course, there's a lot of contemporary politics and legislation that is being considered, recently pushed to January, around fixing elements of the Settlement Act. I'm not going to go super deep into that. Just I do want to make the connection between our overall, as Wabanaki people, our overall well-being and our sovereignty, I think, are very critical. So key dates, and this is a partial list, but I think many of you, and I'm happy to share, I'll share my slides, of course, Joe, with whomever. These key dates, right? So we have a federal law that made it illegal for non-federal parties to treaty with Indians, and that actually leads directly to the Settlement Act in 1980. And then you have a series of treaties that are again, illegal because of this 1790 federal law, where a fair amount, portion of lands are taken or treated. I think we'll talk a little bit about that through these treaties. The state of Maine is created. The first act to regulate sort of Indian life is within the first year of the state. And you have a series of court cases, Murch versus Telmer, State versus Newell, the Indian Citizenship Act in 1924, Proctor Report, 1942, the delay in Indians' ability to vote, ending first with federal elections in 1954 and then later in state elections in 1967. The Passamaquoddy v. Morton case recognizing that the federal government actually has a trust responsibility to the tribes here in Maine, and then another report on the status of Native people, and then our recognition, Passamaquoddy Penobscot recognition, and then the Settlement Act in 1980. This is just key dates. And of course, I'm sure everyone knows where we're all located. This isn't the lands, but the seat of government for the Wabanaki tribal nations. So some of the key concepts that are not taught readily in schools is to really think about how treaties should be understood and read. And these are talked about as the Indian canons of construction around statutes and treaties. And this is very important in terms of under duress often, and without good translations or on purpose mistranslations, treaties should be interpreted with all ambiguities construed in favor of Indians, and that these ambiguities should be considered as construed as the Indians would have understood them. And most importantly, and this is a really important concept to get across, is that what is not expressly granted is retained by Indians, tribal nations. So this is a really key topic. I think in the classrooms I've been in, oftentimes things like our Settlement Act or our sovereignty or our treaty rights are somehow special things given to Indians, but when in fact it's quite the opposite. It is the retained, what was being retained, and so much of it has been taken through many of these agreements. So these are not special rights, these are retained rights. And I see that language, the confusion over that language is really important. So the treaty reserved rights, again, just there's a whole series of case laws that tribes retain sort of all elements of original Indian title until the tribes affirmatively act to give up this title. And so this right cannot be lost through silence or just the arrival in presence of other people, although this has been point of contention for quite a while. And so in summary, what's again not expressly relinquished is retained by tribal nations. And then with inherent tribal sovereignty, similarly, our sovereignty as tribal nations exists prior to the creation of the United States, prior to the state of Maine existing, and so is not a grant, again, of our sovereignty. So one of the things I want to point out, and I've done this as part of, there was a Maine Historical Society exhibit called Redact, and Donna and a bunch of us sort of worked on that and gave presentations looking at parts of the Maine Constitution that have been redacted. But one of the things that I don't think that gets much attention is the original language in our state constitution that recognizes, of course, here in Article 2, Section 1, talking about electors, it's only male citizens age of 21 years and older that actually get to vote in 1820. But then there are lists of people who aren't allowed to, paupers, persons under guardianship, and Indians not taxed. It doesn't say Indians. It says Indians not taxed, and that has a really particular history to it. And my argument is that actually here in the state constitution, this is a recognition of us as separate entities, as sovereign entities, because it's a possibility of another taxation base. And I think that's a really important part of the framing originally in the state constitution, along with the parts that are eventually redacted, recognizing the treaty rights of Wabanaki tribal nations. Of course, today this reads explicitly, every Indian residing on tribal reservations and otherwise qualified shall be an elector. Again, Maine is only one of 5 states to have this Indians not taxed section in the state constitution. So here in Article 10, Section 5, subsection 5, this is part of the state constitution that was later omitted from printing later in the 19th century. The Constitution talks about the recognition of treaties so that the state of Maine shall assume and perform all the duties and obligation of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts towards Indians within the District of Maine, whether the same arise from treaties or otherwise, and for this purpose shall obtain the assent of said Indians. So this is a direct language in the state constitution that says any changes to these treaties must be done with the assent or consent of Indians. So it can't be a unilateral decision. This is what's in the actual language of the state constitution. Maine separated, as you all know, from Massachusetts in 1820. During negotiations, Massachusetts demanded that as a new state, Maine was now responsible for Massachusetts' obligations and treaty annuities to Wabanaki tribes. Beginning in January of 1876, the state of Maine began excluding Article 10, Sections 1, 2, and 5 from printed copies of the state constitution. Section 5, comprised of these articles of separation, includes Maine agreeing as a condition of statehood to defend native treaties with Massachusetts, as I just pointed out. And although redacted, Section 5 remains in full force with the same effect as if it continued in said printed copies, and that was part of the legislation removing it from printing. But that section, and of course, Section 5 is this consent element of the articles and the treaties. And of course, Maine has violated this repeatedly, and part of the way to to violate this has been by merely removing Section 5 from view as a way to engage with tribal lands, take tribal lands at different times, using even the Indian Trust Fund to purchase lands for state use and later sale to non-native people. The timing of the redaction, and I urge you to go to the Maine Historical Society website. You can see a lot more about the run-up and proliferation around this redaction. The timing indicates that Maine wished to obscure its obligations at the time to compensate the Passamaquoddy tribe for 15 islands lost in an 1874 court decision called Granger versus Avery, and to pay associated legal costs. These lands were explicitly reserved in a 1794 treaty with Massachusetts and should have guaranteed the tribe's possession. Here, Maine ignored its liabilities. At the same time, it prohibited the printing of Section 5. So there you have that sort of episode of the redaction. So in terms of the constitutional order, teaching, I think, about changes to the state constitution and including this as critical elements of it, I think are are a nice entry point to civics teaching. The Indians not taxed language has these broader federal implications. It appears in the US Constitution in Article 1, Section 2. It's also in the 14th Amendment, where Indians not taxed is discussed and recognized. Section 2, in redefining apportionment of representatives to Congress actually explicitly excludes Indians. In the original US Constitution, the apportionment does not include Indians, which is an interesting thought experiment as to how that went through at the time. So why was this included in this phrase, Indians not taxed, included in the state constitution and the 14th Amendment? And this is from the sort of handbook of federal Indian law, which is first published in 1940 by the Department of Interior, the solicitor's office there. This is the Cohen sort of background and overview of federal Indian law. So this language reflected first the prevalent notion that taxation or representation should go hand in hand. So if you cannot be taxed for whatever reason or do not pay taxes, you should not be able to vote or be represented. It reflected that the fact that government taxation is a principal criteria of governmental authority. It reflected, thirdly, that the condition of the Indian living was in his separate and independent community. And finally, being outside the control of either state or federal government, he was an Indian not taxed. And since he did not bear the financial burden of the government, he was not entitled to representation. So this language is a very explicit recognition of Wabanaki tribal sovereignty at the time of the Constitution in 1820, whether it was, on purpose or not, where they got this language from, I don't know. There might be other people who know, but to me, it recognizes, along with the redacted sections, that there is a recognition of inherent ongoing treaty rights, sovereignty, and the like. But of course, this recognition, if it existed at all by the state of Maine, either formally or otherwise, does not last. And by 1842, in the Murch versus Telmer case, which is really a contracts case, there is this language that becomes sort of a reference point for later courts to think about and use to undermine the recognition of Wabanaki tribal rights treaties and whatnot. And it's an explicitly racialized way to disabuse any of these rights. So the court said the imbecility on the Indians' part and the dictates of humanity on ours have necessarily prescribed to them their subjection to our paternal control in disregard of some, at least, of abstract principles of the rights of man. I like how these are just abstract in this rendering. So Indians not taxed, which is a way to say Indians are not included from the state of Maine. They're using this otherness to make it quickly about race and imbecility. And this becomes the defining interpretation by the state of Maine as to how to treat Maine Indians. Really, from this point and earlier, I think, since even the laws and that I referenced before in 1821 regulating Indian life, really setting up a paternalistic racist structure of control based around racialization discourses and protecting state interests around seizing native lands for the next 150, 180 years. In the 19th and 20th century, there are all these sort of interesting contradictions around how to engage with this discourse, the legacy of the Indians not taxed, with this heavy racialization and disabuse of second-class citizenship and paternalism. In a treaty hunting rights case, State versus Newell in 1892, the Maine Supreme Court denies the exercise of off-reservation Passamaquoddy treaty hunting rights. While both the state and the Passamaquoddy use the name and recognize tribal identity, the state says that because they can no longer, the court says, I should say, the Supreme Court says, they can no longer make war and peace and therefore cannot exercise these treaty rights. In fact, they say they're no longer a tribe, even though they keep referring to them as the Passamaquoddy tribe. And there's a whole division of state government through the Indian agents that refer to these people and their places as tribes and tribal. So it's an interesting conundrum. I mean, obviously they're trying to drive a truck through this seeming contradiction and make, on the fly statements about why these rights should not. There's no precedent for this notion that treaty rights are extinguished because of this rule of making war and peace. And in fact, I'm not even sure that's true. Maybe the Passamaquoddies could have waged war in 1892. I don't. It has no precedent, so there's no real logic to it except to say that these rights don't exist. This case and others like it ignored all the federal Indian law cases and concepts and maintained Indians as second-class citizens with no rights to manage our own resources or vote, and interpreting Indians not taxed as simply other and racial. It was this approach, ignoring federal law and imposing a racial secondary status, that led to this Passamaquoddy v. Morton case and the need for the Maine Indian Claim Settlement Act. I want to talk a little bit about this identity and sort of framework, and I'd just like to share this story about Aunt Lucy Nicolar, also known as Princess Watawasso. In January of 1900, Lucy visited the Women's Debating Society in New York City. At the end of a lively discussion about immigration, the debaters resolved that it was dangerous and threatening to all true Americans. And according to a journalist who wrote about the event, Lucy took their conclusion as her cue to rise and speak. And then her stately form, as noted by the reporter, commanding instant recognition. She says, "I believe I am the only true American here. I think you have decided rightly. Of all my forefathers' country, from the St. John River to the Connecticut, we have but a little island 1/2 mile square. There are only about 500 of us now. We are very happy on our island, but we are poor. The railroad corporations, which did their share of robbing us of our land, are now begrudging us half-rate fare. But we forgive you all." And that led to a long silence, and the subject was laid on the table. The president of the society said that the musical feature would have to be omitted as the pianist was sick, and asked, would someone please volunteer? According to the reporter, no one had the courage to try an impromptu before that large audience. At last, who should beg to be allowed to try but Lucy, Princess Watawasso, who played some selections from Chopin with the greatest ease and sang a plaintive air which touched the hearts of all those present and made them feel like doing anything in the world. This wrangling over citizenship and separateness, it continues into the 20th century, believe it or not. And much like Lucy's rendition and understanding of this debate over immigration and citizenship, we have another sort of concrete example of this. The Native American Citizenship Act of 1924, which was originally proposed first in 1917 to 1918, was the act that formally gave Native people US citizenship, by an act of Congress. But in Maine and many other states, they were not given the right to vote, neither state or federal elections. They mobilized various forms of Jim Crow and other illegal methods just to maintain the second-class paternalistic control. Interestingly, in 1920, the Passamaquoddy tribe petitioned then Governor Carl Milliken to support the tribe's exemption from this citizenship. And this is a curricular focus of one of the Abbey Museum's lessons. We, the undersigned members of the Passamaquoddy tribe of Indians, humbly beg the state of Maine to use her influence against making Indians citizens of the United States for the following reasons. We are satisfied with our lot as Indians. We've always been loyal to America. In the Revolutionary War, the Passamaquoddy tribe gave her whole strength for the cause. They fought under Colonel Allen. And when in a speech to the Massachusetts Congress, Colonel Allen said in part, "These Indians who have been in the service of the United States shall be taken care of in a fatherly way by the United States, and they shall enjoy every right and privilege." In the Civil War, again, speaking of the Passamaquoddy tribe, raised a company of 14 men. In the World War I, we raised a company of 24 men out of a male population of 100. Please use your kind influence. If the law be already passed, let us be exempt from it. So this is a recognition that as bad and as difficult as things are, Passamaquoddy devotion to separateness, sovereignty, and control is firmly still an active notion in the 1920s, as you would think. So Native Americans in voting in Maine after the Citizenship Act, again, still no voting for Indians on reservations. In 1941, a bill titled "An Act Permitting Indians to Vote in State Elections" was presented before the legislature, which proposed a poll tax, of course, although all Native people had been made citizens of the US in 1924. After the refusal of the Supreme Judicial Court to even consider it, saying it was inherently illegal and insufficient, the law was withdrawn from consideration. After World War II, Wabanaki veterans and others made delegations to the United States House of Representatives and to the United Nations, calling attention to their condition. And this can be found in a number of sources. In the 1950s, the Penobscot Nation sent a delegation to the United Nations after we were being threatened with termination by the state of Maine, and that led to some withdrawal or a thought of terminating us. And finally, in 1954, Indians on reservations in the state of Maine were allowed to vote in federal elections. And there's Lucy right there, casting the first vote. I think it's the first vote, someone could correct me, at the Penobscot Nation. You know, I just think that full circle of her talking about citizenship and rights in a women's debating society and 54 years later voting is quite extraordinary. Full enfranchisement of Indians in Maine would not happen until 1967, when Maine reservation Indians could vote in state elections fully with representation. In 1942, the Proctor Report is one of the first sort of investigations on sort of the status of what's happening with Maine Indians. Our friend Darren Ranco talks about the Proctor Report in her 2004 book. Here, the report talks about tribal members growing up believing they were paupers and totally dependent on the state, that they were left with little or no dignity or self-respect. What they were not aware that the goods and services for which they were begging from the Indian agent, who sometimes would begrudgingly give them, were actually bought with the tribe's own money. and with their own resources. The simple fact is that the state of Maine stole tribal lands and resources and impounded the trust fund monies during World War II to pay for state expenses incurred by the war, totally draining the trust funds. So again, illegal, immoral, ongoing violations of and racist acts. So the legacy, there are some strong legacies of racism, even the way the the Proctor Report is written, of course. And here on page 9 of the Proctor Report, the Indian is apt to work until he gets his first pay and then quit until he has money again. They are unwilling to exert themselves mentally in school. The Indians are shiftless, take no care of their houses or land, and little of themselves. I mean, these are, you could, of course, apply these renderings, these descriptions to other racialized groups in the US at this time. So it really didn't matter. It was just like mobilizing all the racist tropes, even in this official report, to explain why Indians are not doing very well in the 1940s. In 1974, there's this fairly major civil rights report published in collaboration of the US Commission on Civil Rights, in collaboration with a number of entities in the state of Maine. Here, there are some interesting statistics. This is just one example, sort of describing the status of Indians and what things were happening in the 1970s. One is just these unemployment rates among Maine Indians was so high in 1973 that the state labor department had to create its own category to understand what it was for the very first time. In there, they talk about, for reservation Indians, it's estimated that unemployment is between 60 and 80%, 60% at Penobscot, 70% at two Passamaquoddy reservations. Among off-reservation Indians, approximately 50% are unemployed, and the unemployment rate among all Maine Indians was about 65% in 1973. Accompanied with these statistics are, of course, of extremely racist hiring and non-hiring practices, people wanting to work but not being hired by white employers, even in the 60s and 70s. In 2012, we have these statistics, Maine Indian income and employment statistics, and I just took these from the Passamaquoddy Health Needs Assessment Summary Report that was came out in 2013. Here you have just a look at the social and economic indicators in terms of the Passamaquoddies overall across the Wabanaki tribal nations, all of the tribes in 2012, and then Washington County, and then the whole state of Maine. So you can see this sort of unemployment rates 2-3 times greater within the tribes. The education rates are almost equivalent, which is a huge advancement in terms of, and I think is a recognition that since the 1980s, the tribes have had more control over their own schools and have been able to send our students to a variety of schools, even off reservation, and having some school choice for high school. But still, the household income rates just being vastly different, and the issues related to employment still holding some sway in 2012. Another frame has to do with the Maine Wabanaki State Child Welfare Statistics and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that finished its work a few years ago. I strongly urge you to all read the final report for the Maine Wabanaki State Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Here we can compare some statistics again from that sort of early middle 70s of the rate at which Maine Indian children were placed in foster care. In 72, it was 25 times higher. In 73, it was 20 times higher. In 1975, it was 19 times higher. For Aroostook County in 1972, the rate of removal for Indian children was 62 times higher than the statewide rate for non-Indian children. The rates for Maine were the second highest in the nation at the time of removal of Indian children. In the session that I was in with Star Kelly in the previous session, she talks about the really important and moving documentary called Dawnland that sort of goes over that, as well as the attempts to fix this through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. From 2000 to 2013, Wabanaki children in Maine have entered foster care on average of 5 times the rate of non-native children. So, and this is post, Indian Child Welfare Act, which recognizes tribal interest in Native children, and as well as a number of other initiatives. So this ongoing legacy, of course, that's 5 times is still much better than 25 times, but this ongoing legacy of practice within DHHS and the removal of Indian children is still an ongoing problem, and that's what led to, of course, the creation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Both of these situations, and I could go on, there's so many others, both of these situations, child welfare, employment, clearly demonstrate a few things. Paternalism, racism, and state control have been bad for Wabanaki tribal nations, of course. Federal recognition and the Settlement Act, even as it's been poorly interpreted in respect to our sovereignty, have made things better. There are still huge disparities, right? So try to give you a sense that the employment and the child welfare issues have gotten better. Of course, they have. Part of that is federal recognition, a little bit more control, a little, less paternalism, ongoing legacies of racism still. There are still disparities, but I think if you look around at the evidence that these disparities can be addressed by recognizing and enhancing Wabanaki tribal sovereignty. Every piece of evidence that I'm aware of is these statistics get better, our well-being gets better as tribal nations, the more we are in control over our own destinies as sovereign entities. And I think that's, that sort of ongoing legacy that originally, right, from 1820, a recognition of us as a sovereign, as Indians not taxed, this intense racialization and paternalism and second-class citizenry, and our ongoing fight out of that can only possibly end with us as sovereign and dictating our futures as sovereign entities as possible. So I'll end there and stop the share. So even despite John taking my time, I ended, I think, 5 minutes early. Am I right, Joe? What do we do?
Darren, as expected, you did a wonderfully fantastic job.
Yeah, I know you understand that I'm a youngest child and need that kind of affirmation. Happy to take any questions. Again, I wish I could point you all as teachers to specific, resources. I think the Abbey covers a few elements of this in their curriculum. I think that'll be filled out in the short to medium term with what's happening in the Portland School District. We've been reviewing some of this sort of political Indian policy history, but I think there's any number of ways to take this. I'm not, I'm an educator, but not at the K through 12 level, but I'm really hoping that more of these issues can be incorporated into your curriculum. Oh, and I see if Dawn is here, of course, she knows like 10 times more than I do about this. Part of me telling this narrative the way I do is I'm trying to capture this idea that there's an original intent, somewhere in the original state constitution of us as separate. Of course, the redacted parts of the Constitution mention our treaties and all of that stuff. So I think that's a really, it just helps reinforce this notion of what is not explicitly given away is retained as well. I think that's a hard one. It's a hard one. I grew up in Maine, although I moved away at some point to get all my fancy education. But I grew up in Maine, and I still hear this today, like of the quote unquote special rights of Indians, and that it's like a grant, like an affirmative action. And it's just not the case. It's just such a simple mistake that's made by even well-intentioned people. But how you tell that story is really important in terms of the education around these issues.
Patty, do you have a question? I know you'd posted one in the chat.
Do you want me to say it? Okay.
Ooh, Patty.
Okay, I just had a question about that measuring of unemployment. I never really thought about it this way, but if someone has or wants to pursue a sort of self-sustained lifestyle or life way, does that get counted as unemployed? Because is unemployed not receiving a paycheck?
Yeah, and I think my understanding of it is it's more the latter. This idea of receiving a consistent paycheck. I think it's actually, they used a different rubric for this a little bit in the 70s than they did actually in 2000, in 2012 or whatever the other statistics were done. But yeah, I mean, I think it's generally, how it is today. I think in the 70s slightly differently, this sort of notion of, consistent ongoing employment. I mean, it fails to capture certain forms of seasonal labor, of course, that many tribal members and citizens have engaged in, even more so in the 70s than now, but still now. So it's not capturing totally the lifestyles that people are choosing to a certain extent, maybe choosing, although just the evidence in the 70s in particular of people not being hired simply because they're Indian is pretty alarming. So I mean, I think it's just statistics, damn statistics and lies, of course they're all as misleading or informative as we want them to be, for sure.
There was one other question in the chat.
Libby.
Yep.
Yeah.
That one. Okay.
I think, I think between, I can't say there's a definitive study, but I think between the work that was done on Invisible, which was an earlier documentary, as well as Dawnland, and then the teacher there's a curriculum, support curriculum for Dawnland that reflected a bunch of research that went into that. The Upstander Project, working with Chris Newell, did a really great job at putting together a curriculum in support of Dawnland. So Libby, I think that curriculum in support of Dawnland is a really great place to start. I don't know if that's exactly what you mean, significant study, but I think, of course, Dawnland was more about recent history than it was about the deeper residential school history. Invisible tries to address that. So I'm trying to think if there are any papers or products. James Francis was one of the leaders of that, of the Invisible kind of research framework. So I can reach out to him, see if there was other documents produced.
And I'll just say very quickly, just in case anybody is watching this webinar in the future and doesn't have access to the chat, the question was about Wabanaki children and boarding in residential schools. Yeah. So I think Darren kind of hits on that, but just in case you're like, I don't know what the question was. So with that, Darren, I'll thank you again for your time. You did mention that you'll send along a copy of the presentation, so we'll get that loaded up. So thank you everybody for this session.
Thanks. And the next session is Nolan, and he's awesome. Happy to call him my once student. So see you, everyone.